Happy to see all of you, no matter where you are coming from this evening. And that's certainly with our guests tonight of where in the world is Richard and Carla. I love playing that game and so excited to have both of you here. So this is Raid Your or Our Cellar for Benchmark Wine Group. My name is John McDaniel. I am a sommelier by definition of I'm a wine guy that figured out how to get paid for that over the last few years. I'm based here in downtown Chicago, coming to you live from my coat closet. And when the team at Benchmark said, we would love to have you pick a producer to share the story of their wines. You know, we've had Gosset and we've had so many kind of iconic producers. And the first thing that came to my mind is I would love to taste with Richard and Carla. And so happy to be with both of you tonight and to taste the wines of An Approach to Relaxation, a really cool project that the both of them have put together in Vinevale in the Napa Valley in Australia. So Richard, Carla, welcome. Good evening or good afternoon. Where in the world are you right now, by the way?
We're in Hawaii right now, randomly.
Because why not, right?
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. It's good to see your face.
Absolutely, and happy to have people as they're kind of joining in. So as people are kind of coming in, before we kind of dive into Approach to Relaxation and how two American sommeliers made their way to Australia through all of the craziness, why don't you kind of give a little background on each of you individually, and your careers have both been amazing, and then how you came together.
Love it. You want to go first or second? Okay, so we're switching computers here. So I'll go first. And now you get us in stereo. Cool. All right, now you go first.
Okay, so what, we're introducing ourselves?
Yeah, who are you? How'd you get here?
How did we get here? I'm Carla. I guess I should start. I'm from California. I ended up in New York because I went there for acting to NYU. And then through working in restaurants, I absolutely fell in love with wine. I got offered a job to take over the wine buying for a restaurant that I was bartending in at the time, the Breslin in the Ace Hotel in New York. And I absolutely did not know enough to take over the wine program, but the good little angel on my shoulder said, you have to say yes to this offer. So I did, and ended up buying for that group of restaurants for a few years before I fell in love with this guy and was feeling very comfortable stepping down at that position at that time in New York. And we left New York in a blaze of glory and went on a 4-month road trip across the South. And we currently we ended up starting a wine project, An Approach to Relaxation, which we're tasting through today. And just to give you one final piece of information, we live in Amsterdam. So it is a little odd that we're in Hawaii today. We're visiting family here for about a month and a half. But yeah, that's the general story. And then you go for it.
So I come to this a long time ago. It's been a minute, but originally thought I was going to do environmental law, and decided that wasn't for me. So I ended up cooking for a short period of time, and then I got into wine and had the most amazing wine job in Aspen, Colorado, for a number of years. Had a professional milestone occur, and after that point, decided it was one thing to just learn about it, and then another thing to actually get dirty and make it. So I wanted to do that. So I started making wine with the 2001 vintage in Australia. It grew to include Napa, Hermitage in France, and Friuli actually in northeastern Italy. Since that time, I've also made wine in Bordeaux and in Provence. And now together, the only wines we're making now, we sold this company, so the only wines we make now are together, Carla and I, the wines we'll taste today in Australia. I also make a little bit of tequila, Tequila Comos, which is actually brand new to the world, and very excited about that. And yeah, all kinds of fun stuff.
And scratch and sniff books.
Oh yeah, and scratch and sniff books. We wrote a scratch and sniff wine book actually, which was released back in 2013. Did really well. It's actually a very cool book. I say that not in a self-aggrandizing way. It actually is a pretty interesting book. You can learn a whole lot in 20 pages of scratching and sniffing. And then we followed on with a whiskey book, same thing, and then did a scratch and sniff beer book. And then there's a scratch and sniff cannabis cookbook coming out on the 20th of April.
420.
4:20. So
Perfect timing. Perfect timing.
generally busy doing the things we love.
Wonderful. And that's the amazing thing about, our small world of wine and food and all the things that tie into it, of, the amount of times that we have all crossed paths together is pretty amazing. Richard, I remember the kind of the first time that we hang out was with dive bars in Flagstaff, you, me, and Bobby. And I remember about 19% of that. I would say, and just in learning about your background, and it certainly makes a lot of sense when I hear you talk about wine. And Carla, I remember the first time that you and I met was at some sort of it was like a food festival in Chicago, and you came up to me like, I think we know about 90 of the same people, and we kind of just went from there. And so great to be with you and to see how this amazing project has come to fruition, and being able to taste these wines. And it was a no-brainer for me to share these wines with Benchmark, and so excited to see the success there. So let's start from the beginning. Of obviously, Richard, you said you made wine previously in Australia, with some beautiful wines there. How did an approach to relaxation come about, and what does that mean to you? Certainly an interesting and very long name when it comes to a winery name.
And when it comes to emails too, we made the mistake of not doing just AATR. So now it's like Carla, an approach to relaxation.
And wine lists.
And wine lists, yeah. Well, I'll tell you about the name first, and then we can kind of go into why we decided to work in the Barossa. The name is essentially, before COVID, we were traveling about 225 days a year with this work, with the wine work, with his tequila work, and previous mezcal work. A lot of travel, and when you travel that much, it's easy to get bogged down by the travel and to become very exhausted. And so this is kind of the title is a little bit a tongue-in-cheek kind of nod to, like, there are many approaches to relaxation, but like this is one of ours. And there's a cheeky background to the labels too, but we can get to the labels and the names of the wines later. The background about the project, I guess it started with Richard's previous project with Betts and Joel. He was making sand-grown Grenache with the Betts and Joel project. And when we were living in Colorado, between leaving New York and moving to Amsterdam, we decided to start up this project again because Richard had something that he still wanted to say about making old vine Grenache being grown in sand. And I was in love with all of these Australian wines from having sold them in New York. While a lot of people don't think of the Barossa in terms of being a cool climate, it is not a cool climate. While it is still a warm climate and changing a lot with climate change, where we work in the Barossa is the coolest area in the Barossa. So the Vine Vale is the only sandy area. Later on, when we go through some photos, we can show you why that area is quite different than the rest of the Barossa. Should we look at those now, or should we look at them later?
Let's do it. Yeah, I think giving a little context too, because I know the Barossa is one of the places that when we think of definitely some of the warmest and ripest wines that you can find on planet Earth. There's some of the old vine Shiraz that come from this area, but to compare and as we taste through the Grenache here in a little bit, definitely it's the visuals I think would be great.
Hold on just a minute. There we go. Okay. There we go. Yeah, the visuals definitely help. All right. So just to give you a little bit more context, Australia's huge. And we are down here in this area. So we're in the state of South Australia, and we're in the Barossa Valley in South Australia. The Barossa tends to be, like, historically was very well known in like the peak of Australian wine sales in the United States for giving a lot of high-end red wines and giving a lot of old vine wines. And in the Barossa specifically, giving very kind of like high octane wines. So in the United States specifically, there's still a little bit of an assumption that some of what happens in the Barossa is this very, very high alcohol, very dark fruited, very kind of broad shouldered wines. But that's because a lot of what, well, here's an old, let me continue this idea about the soil first. It's because a lot of the wines are grown on this heavy red soil, which we'll see in a second. The reason that an approach to relaxation and Sucette and Nichon are different is because they're grown on the sand. This is an old photo from the 1800s, and it's just to show the sand in the old vines back then. They were still working with a lot of bush vines and this old kind of this old, very, very deep sand. So these are the different soil types across the Barossa Valley. The Vine Vale right here, which is where we are squarely located, is the only area where you don't find a heavy percentage of red clay. We have about a meter of that really, really fine white sand, which is decomposed granite and quartzite, and that's over the red clay. So what that allows us to do, and the reason it brought us down there in the beginning, is because these old vines can exist in this sand and their deep roots reach down through that meter of sand into the clay. And because they hit the clay, which is a water holding type of soil, they're allowed to be dry grown. And based on where we are in terms of wind coming down from the foothills, they can be fairly disease resistant. Here's a great view of the two different soil types. This is like a vineyard cut from our own vineyard. Again, this is the decomposed granite and quartzite, and then that kind of sticky, wet red clay. This is our vineyard. In the background here, that's the Barossa Ranges, and then beyond that is the Eden Valley. The Eden Valley is typically known for cooler vine Shiraz or Syrah that looks more like Northern Rhone Syrah than it does like Barossa Valley Shiraz, and Riesling. You can also find a lot of Riesling up there because it's cooler temperatures. I tell you that in order to say, over time, these gullies, through wind, erosion, water, they've deposited some of that decomposed granite and quartzite down into the Vine Vale. And that's why this is the only area with sand. Also, hot or cool air slips down from the Eden Valley, also down through those gullies and hits this area of the Vine Vale. And that's what makes it the coolest area in the Barossa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, before we leave the slide here. So this is midwinter. It's after pruning, of course. That's why there's not a whole lot of material on what look like bonsai stumps here. But if you also look at the stumps or the vines themselves, they're all pointing to the left. I think you can all see that. And the reason that is because over the last 155 years or whatever it is that they've been alive, that breeze has taken that effect, right? So it's the cooling breezes. It's also called the Vine Vale Nurse. I don't know if you said that or not, but it blows hard. And so of course, it blows young plant material in the direction it's going. And so that's why all of these vines lean to the left. It's pretty remarkable.
It's also why this area is safer with disease, because that constant kind of rushing through of the wind is good for the vines in terms of disease resistance.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing. So was this a vineyard or an area that you had worked with previously with Betts and Scholl, or how did you come across the Vine Vale and the vineyard that you're working with for your wines now?
That's a great question. So what you're looking at is an aerial view of the vineyard before we took out all of the olive trees, which are on the upward side of this. And if you drove on that road, you wouldn't have even known this vineyard was there. So at one point it was a whole lot bigger, and all the surrounding vineyards were also old vine stuff, which, shamefully someone ripped out and planted, new basically agri-farming grossness. And what was left was that the 15 that's in the center of the old vine stuff, and that was a block that was just hiding in there. The winery we work at is literally in the same spot, but a kilometer away to the south. And we've been working there for almost 20 years and had no idea it was there. We work with a 6th generation Barossa family. They had no idea it was there, and they live a kilometer from it. And I've been buying grapes about, 150 meters from there. We're at the bottom. So that's new stuff. But if you walk through those new Cabernet vines, about 150 meters, you get to another old Grenache plot. And we've been buying grapes from that plot for Betts and Scholl. And when Carla and I wanted to start an approach Relaxation and begin to grow our project, we went back to that grower and asked to buy some of those grapes. And I'll make a long twisted story short. He said yes. We took delivery of the grapes at the time when we thought they needed to be picked. We made the wine. We went away after harvest. We came back the next year and we tasted it out of barrel. It's actually one of the wines you have here today, 2016. We tasted it out of barrel one morning. It's like, wow, this is great. I'm so excited with these grapes we bought from this guy. We walked outside to start our work for the day, and it was a barrel tasting. We walked out of the barrel room back into the winery and to start our work for the day, and this big man drives right into the winery with his truck and says, "Where's Carla and Richard?" And we're like, what do you mean, where's Carla and Richard? Like, who's asking? He's like, well, I have a problem. And it's like, okay, this isn't going very well. And we say, okay, well, I'm Richard. Here's Carla. How can we help you? And he said, well, those grapes you thought you bought from Mr. So-and-so last year? And I'm like, yeah. They were great. We just tasted the wine. It's amazing. He's like, well, those weren't his grapes at all. He bought my grapes and sold them to you as if they were his own. And we're like, what? And all the things go through your head, like, F this guy. But at the same time, you're like, well, the wine was really, really awesome. So you're simultaneously surprised and mad and
torn.
And torn.
Should we buy those again?
And also happy. And he said to us, well, he was going to do that to you again this year, except he wasn't oversubscribed, so he didn't need my grapes. So I'm here left holding the bag. I grew all these grapes for you ostensibly, and he hasn't sold them to you. So you want some more grapes? And we said, well, I think we have enough this year, but I don't know. We don't want you to be stuck, even though this is no fault of our own. He said, just come for a drive, come see it. So he drives us around. We go through these olive trees here, where it says road, pull in and see these amazing ancient vines. And I risked our marriage at that moment. We got out of the car and immediately said, well, how about we just buy the vineyard? I didn't speak to Carla. I had no idea how much it cost. I had no idea how big it would be. I knew the idea about any of this stuff, but having spent so much time down there and really just around the world, when you see something so special, weird things fall out of your mouth. Like, let's buy it. And again, to make the long story short, 36 hours later, we were chatting with the old Italian owner in this shack here, which was filled with black widow spiders and wine that he made himself. And writing up on an old restaurant dupe pad, where you slipped a piece of carbon between the two sheets. And, Mr. Samuel Cosciarelli, for the sum consideration of X, to Carla and Richard Rizabet's, 6.63 hectare vineyard of old vine Grenache. And we were done. So it was crazy and wild, and it worked. And now it's the Rizablock.
Oh, yeah. So
love it.
And this is how it changed. He was this old Italian who had moved here. When did he move here?
Right after World War II.
Yeah. So he moved there to work in a car factory, actually. And so he created from this old block. He bought it. We asked him how, he's since passed away, but last time we saw him, he said he just saw an ad for it and he went and he wanted to create his own like old Italian style vineyard. So he didn't touch any of these old vines, but he planted all of this in lines here. That's all 30-year-old Grenache from own cuttings from the old vine stuff. And this is some Grenache. It was some Mataro, but we've since changed that back to Grenache. We'll talk about that in a minute, but all of this is like citrus trees. This is all huge pieces of prickly pear. These are 160 olive trees. And so since then, we've changed all of that to young vine Grenache. All this is still the 30-year-old stuff. This, we've left space in case we want to put a winery there at one point, and then all of this is Grenache. So where there is a little bit of Mataro or Mourvedre, we lopped off the top and grafted Grenache back onto the top. And then we created rootlings with cuttings from the old vine in the Yalumba nursery, and we've planted all of this to young Grenache. So it's 100% Grenache, all own rooted, all on its own rootstock.
All our own genetic material.
Yeah.
And we know from records in the surveyor's office, this is literally the 20th land grant in the entirety of South Australia. So when Australia was becoming a country, this was literally the 20th piece of land that was given away. So these vines are from the very, very beginning of the creation of the country. It's something special.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, let's get something in our glass here, and we'll fast forward all the way, and we'll go chronologically backwards, but in some sort of tasting order forwards. And let's start with the Semillon. And I know that this is definitely a newer passion project in what we're doing with Approach to Relaxation here. And so this is Nichon from 2017, and it is 90% Semillon and 10% Sauvignon Blanc. And why don't you talk about a little of how this Semillon kind of came to be and what was the inspiration here?
When Richard and I, we started, so the first vintage of the Sucette, the Grenache, was 2014, and the first vintage of Nichon, the Semillon, was 2015. We decided to kind of play around with making a white because we had we still do have a huge crush on a few winemakers, Terry Layton from Kaylin Cellars in California. And then also, hold on, I'm gonna stop sharing this just so I can see some faces. Yay. And then also Serge Hochar and Marc Hochar, his son, of Chateau Moussard. We love those whites. Those whites for us are very savory whites. They're very textural. Both of them, while Moussard, it works with a clone of Semillon. Terry Layton is working with Semillon as well. And we love that the Semillon, when it gets old, it takes on, after as a few years of age, and you can start to see it in this 2017, it starts to take on this kind of full-bodied, soft, sometimes kind of waxy character. And it's always more savory than it is fruity, which is exciting to us. And then once it continues to age further, it loses some of that full-bodied, waxy quality, and it just gets very, this is gonna sound bad, but I mean it in a very loving way. It gets almost bony at the end and kind of skeletal. And it's so fascinating to us when the wine turns into something like that. And so we had never worked with Semillon, but we were interested in seeing what was possible there. So that was kind of this is our homage to those winemakers.
And when you think of Semillon in Australia, the one place that we think of is the Hunter Valley. How for you is this different than the Hunter Valley? Because certainly climatically very different, location different. What is different in the expression for you versus kind of if we're looking at the classic benchmark of Australian Semillon?
It's a great question. I'm happy to. The Hunter Valley is their hallmark tasting note is they pick very early on purpose. It's what they do. It's the style. So it ages extraordinarily well, but it is like acid ripping across your teeth until like year 10. So if you can find Hunter Valley Semillon with some age on it, we think it starts getting interesting at around 10 years old. It's super, super exciting. And again, that kind of bony quality, that weird, like ghosty, savory thing is thrilling. But in the first 10 years, it just needs to be put down. It needs to be put to sleep because that early pick style and that kind of like maritime climate the acid is ripping. And they use a lot of stainless steel. They're not using a ton of oak. And we soften ours with a little bit of oak here. So you can go over the winemaking, I guess.
Yeah. So the wine itself, we look to, of course, as noted, Kaylin Cellars, Chateau Moussard in Lebanon, but also having spent some time in Friuli and thinking about the winemaking there, there's a neat approach that's taken in some of, I think, the better addresses there, which is to use the influence of wood, be it new or nearly new, but don't go through malolactic fermentation. So you build richness, but preserve a spine. And so we use this trick here. There's no new wood, but it's wood it's French oak, of course. It's been used once for Chardonnay by someone else who makes great wine. And then, so we barrel ferment. So it's essentially pick the grapes, whole bunch. The first, and it's usually done in thirds. So 3 passes through the basket press. It doesn't make a whole lot of wine. But the first basket press gets filled up with whole bunch, and it gets pressed. That's a 12-hour cycle. So you have plus or minus 12 hours on those stems and skins and seeds. And then the second batch then has basically 24 hours on the stems, skins, and seeds. And then the third batch has 36 hours, right? And so it's quote unquote skin contact without being this really a caricature of an idea of skin contact where that's all you taste. All of the wines we want to not be about a singular idea, but instead have many different ideas contribute to a more complex and complete whole. And so it's all essentially a whole bunch pressed, a little bit of skin contact, and it's pressed then straight to barrel. So it ferments in these barrels. We use actually a cultured yeast. We're not afraid to say that. There's a lot of like woo-woo around native yeast, and that's great if you work where the yeasts are native. But I've done this wrong. I tried to make a Syrah once and let it go native yeast in the Barossa Valley, and guess what? The yeast strain that got a hold of it wasn't strong enough to finish the job. So then you have Syrah at 9% alcohol and still grossly sweet, and the yeast can't live to finish it off, and you end up throwing it in the garbage. What we like about the champagne yeast is it's subtle, so you can see through it and still see the grape in the place, but also it does its job at cold temperatures. And this is important. So when we do this, we inoculate it and then put it in the cold room. And so it's like 14 degrees Celsius, and it ferments in there over the better part of 3 weeks And that slow, deliberate fermentation actually over all that time builds real character. And it's something that we like very, very much. And then it's merely racked a year later and bottled unfined, unfiltered, with no mallow. So, and this is the result. I think it might be cool to talk about what it looks like when we first make it versus today.
Yeah. And then I see 2 questions here, and we can go on to the 2 questions after that. When we first made this is the 17. The 15 was our first Nichon vintage, and we took out of Kaylin Cellar's kind of suggestion book, the cépage, or the blend of 80% Semillon and 20% Sauvignon Blanc. Once we made that wine and we bottled it and we tasted it, we were like, oh my God, we've made a mistake. The Sauvignon Blanc is too strong at 20%. All you can smell is the Sauvignon Blanc. And what we've learned since then, the next year we decided to bring the Sauvignon Blanc down to 10%. We've kept it at that since then. So 90 Semillon, 10 Sauvignon Blanc. But what we've also learned about the wine is that it's true in the beginning, even with 10% Sauvignon Blanc, the Sauvignon Blanc is the thing that is the most loud. It's the thing that's the most expressive. It's green. It shows all of its classy, grassy characters. And the Semillon is very subdued. We were just talking with John before we got on this call with y'all about how this wine, the 17, us tasting it right now, this for us is the most exciting it's tasted. When it's first put in bottle, it can feel a little skinny, and that's because the Sauvignon Blanc is leading the way and the Semillon just hasn't woken up yet. When the Semillon begins to kind of unfurl and take on weight with age, it gets what you have now. It gets this very kind of silky, round, like lush mouthfeel, which is thrilling to us. That's what we want. But it takes time for Semillon to get there. So one of the questions is, how old can Semillon get? I would say it's one of the best long-living white wines.
Absolutely.
You've definitely had more old Semillon than I have.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I think about, and we're talking about dry, not sweet examples, but dry examples, I've had old white Bordeaux back to the 1920s. That's been amazing. I've had old Australian Semillon back to the 50s, also very, very beautiful. I mean, so we're talking, 70 to 100 years. Although the 20s Bordeaux wasn't 100 years old when I had it, was probably 80 or 90 years old at that point. So, I mean, it can be extraordinarily well and long-lived. It's very cool. And, I mean, we chose it deliberately. We both like old wine. We like this when things become vinous, right? There's an élevage that happens in a winery. It's not fresh wine stuck in a bottle. There's an élevage that happens in a winery, and then there's everything, all this amazing, the magic that's wine that happens when it sits in a cellar, a proper cellar, for a period of time. Like that transition is like nothing else. It's really special.
And one of the reasons that transition happens is because of cork. All of our wines carry a cork. A lot of stay frisky. A lot of Australian Semillon is under screw cap, and a lot of Australian wine in general is under screw cap. And the Australians, ask any of them. I've been on tasting panels with them so many times, and we just go head to head on this. They believe strongly that the wine ages just fine in the bottle, but the Australians are very pragmatic, and so a big reason why they love the screw caps is because you never get any corked wine. But for us, what you give away when you use screw caps is a lot of that evolution in bottle that to us is the romantic part of the wine. You may never get a corked wine, but you get a lot of bottles that don't have a lot of spirit or heart. They just they're very clinical, and they're very, they're kind of like beep, beep, boop. And we want wines that have like elbows and a loud voice and like want to stay up late and party. So
that have the opportunity to become magical.
That have the opportunity to become magical and to turn it, like a Semillon can lose some of its fruitiness under screw cap, but it doesn't ever gain this kind of wonderful, savory, like very, very complex stuff, which that's why we're making it. That's why we love it. Yeah. And one more note about the way we make Nichon compared to the Hunter Valley stuff. We like picking what we think is ripe for the Semillon so that it's good right out the gates. While if you drink it right after it's been bottled, you're going to get just hints of it behind the Sauvignon Blanc, like even a few years in bottle here. This is showing what we want it to show. You don't have to wait 10 years for that. And let's go to one of these questions. Would you recommend decanting the Nichon? I don't think we ever have we?
I mean, if it's if you have 2018 in your grasp, I would put it in decanter. But one real important rule about decanting is don't decant it and walk away from it. Like you could completely miss the fireworks. I see that happen all the time with old wine. People just like, oh, 82 Bordeaux needs to be decanted. I'll check in on it in 2 hours. Like, well, it's gonna be dead in 2 hours. Like, and then you just totally blew it. I wanted to swear just there because it's such an like,
emotional thing.
But no, so yeah, go ahead and decant things. I mean, we decant things at home usually to correct for temperature if something's too cold or to give it a quick bit of air. But we never walk away from it ever. And look, you can taste it, and if it's not yet to your pleasure, walk around for 10 minutes or open a different bottle and drink that, and then keep checking back in on it. But don't leave it for prolonged periods.
Oh, and one more thing. Have you ever put your wines under screw cap? No, we haven't.
Yes, we have.
Yes, we have. Christian did.
No, yes, we have.
For what?
So we made a one-off wine. I think it's important to cover all our bases here. We made a wine that is only for Australia, only for one retailer called Magnolia.
Oh no, I meant the Semillon though.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
well, I don't know. I'm not sure how to read this question, but it says wines.
In general,
yeah. And it's a wine that we made for one outlet, and they wanted it like that because that's what Australians buy. It's not going to be exported. It's a one vintage wonder, and we're just like, yeah, sure, if that's how you want it, great.
But with the Semillon specifically, the winery that we work at, Resden in the Barossa, they were sourcing Semillon from the same place that we were sourcing Semillon, and we made the wines in a similar fashion that year. It was a one-off for them. They never made it again. And they never made it again because they weren't totally happy with the product. And while we sourced from the same spot, picked around the same time, and made the wine similarly, they put theirs under screw cap and we didn't. We tasted that wine 18 months, 2 years after being under screw cap, and it had not moved. And so they were like, we're not crazy about this. Like, I don't think we need to do this again. And yet for us, that was like, that's why we're not doing anything under screw cap. Like, that proves our point.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
You'll get a real box ticker that's just like, look, every bottle lasts. It's like, it lasts like a fossil. It's dead. You suffocated it upon birth. And then like, you have this fossilized wine, but it doesn't swim. So it's totally uninteresting.
Mm-hmm. So when we look at this wine Nichon 17, a blend of 90% Semillon and 10% Sauvignon Blanc, that is a blend that is also a pretty classic, percentages of Sauterne and Barsac. When you look at those, were these vineyards ever planted with the intention of making sweet wine, or were these vineyards always meant for dry Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc?
I can do that.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
When the old vine vineyards, such as both of the Grenache and Semillon, were planted, they were oftentimes the first vineyards planted there. And that's described. Well, let me take one step back. The first settlers there often ended up with 80 acres. So you were a family. You got there. You created your road. You named your road after yourself. Like, for example, we buy the Semillon fruit from a guy named David Neldner, who lives on Neldner Road. It's Neldner Vineyard. It's 80 acres. And here's what they all do. They plant what's known as the Barossa fruit salad, right? And so that fruit salad, they didn't know what was going to work. So they planted Grenache and Shiraz and Cabernet and Pinot Noir and Gamay and Frontignac and Pedro Jimenez and Gewürztraminer and Semillon and Chardonnay and all this stuff, like 20, 25 different grapes. And they would have all of it out there. And then, sort of figured out like what worked and what didn't. And I can't speak to what those wines tasted like in the late 1800s, but when the Australian wine trade really took off and became, actually an industry led by places like Seppeltsfield and Seppelts Winery, the sweet wines were actually a gigantic big deal. So, for example, the Frontignac, Pedro Jimenez, I'm sure some of the Semillon went into it. There's not a lot of botrytis there, if ever. It's very, very rare. So it wouldn't have been used in that sense. But all those things would have been used or left to get very, very ripe. And Grenache too. So Grenache also went into, they called them port or they call them stickies. And, if you leave Grenache out there forever, it gets ultra ripe. And, it's used in baignoules, what have you. So much as California owes the existence of old vine Zinfandel vineyards to the white Zinfandel craze, South Australia owes old Grenache vineyards to the pork craze. Like if there wasn't an appetite for sweet wine, all these things would have been ripped up and it would have looked just like our neighbors down there, you know, agribusiness, Syrah and Cabernet. It's fascinating.
That's really interesting. And finally, the name Nichon, where does that come from? What's the inspiration here?
So here we get into the sticky stuff. When we
as Richard walks away too, I love that.
Richard just whispered to me, "You can take this one." Sure, you need water. Richard, when he was making wines with Betzenschul with Jean-Louis Chauve of the Chauve family in Hermitage, he became friends with Erin Cannon Chauve, Jean-Louis's wife. She's an American. She's fantastic. We love her. And they would sit, Richard was making mezcal at the time, Sombre mezcal, and they would sit on the hill of Hermitage drinking margaritas together. And he had a previous wine project, yet another previous wine project called Saint Glan Glen, and it meant When Pigs Fly. And she helped him name that. It was a Bordeaux project, and she gave him this kind of tongue-in-cheek name. And so when we started our project, he was there visiting them and having the conversation with her again. Well, we have another wine project, and I want the name. We wanted there to be a French name to kind of harken back to this more as elegant as it can be from the Barossa and winemaking styles that are very French compared to Barossan. And she suggested Sucette and Nichon. Richard texted me these things and I like got right down to it. I was like, you know, I looked it up online, Sucette, lollipop. I was like, that's who cares about that? That's nice, it's juicy, but whatever. And then I was like, maybe there's something else. And I like went on, you know, like Urban Dictionary or whatever, like went further down the hole. And it said to suckle. And I was like, that is sexy. And so we were like, okay, cool, to suckle. That's wonderful. It's exciting. And so we were like, an approach to relaxation. Yeah, this could work. And so we chose, if you look at the label here, can anyone tell what this label is? Yeah.
Yep.
The label is a mouth, and it's from an old like 1950s gentleman magazine.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that's to suckle. And then a year later, oh my God, there's one more part of this story. We went to our very first ever portfolio tasting, and a winemaker friend, French, came up to me and he's like, Carla, do you know what you've named your wine? And I was like, yeah, Guillaume, to suckle, so sexy, Grenache, juicy. And he's like, no, he goes, it actually means something a little bit dirtier than that. And I was like, okay, cool. So we're just gonna roll with that. So we decided to go even further down that hole. And when we bottled Nichon, we decided to use Erin's second suggestion, which is Nichon. You should look this one up. But it's just a direct translation. There's nothing you need to Urban Dictionary for that one. But if you can tell, this is a woman's clavicle here. This is Anita Ekberg from La Dolce Vita that we took and recolored. So there are many approaches to relaxation, but this is our favorite. Yeah.
Before we move on to the Sucette, I see a final question on how you would compare Nichon to dry white Bordeaux.
That's a great question. I would say Nichon looks like dry white Bordeaux used to look. They're changing it so much, and I think mostly for the worse. They're you know, people don't know what Semillon is. They don't know how to say it. And a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? And so they do know they love Sauvignon Blanc, and they, you know, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc took over the world, and, you know, whatever, it is what it is. I don't drink very much of that stuff or any, but a lot of people do. And the Bordelais being merchants first and foremost, like, oh, people love Sauvignon Blanc. So they've really shifted those blends to be Sauvignon Blanc forward. I think for me, that's lamentable, but, you know, that's just because I have different taste.
And more oak forward too.
Yeah, they tend to be more oak forward also, some of them. But, you know, something like Haut-Brion Blanc remains just a wine of extreme beauty, regretfully extreme price too. But, you know, the whole host of like, you know, $20 to $50 Bordeaux Blancs, those are really Sauvignon Blanc heavy now, and they didn't used to be. So I think this is a little bit more of what used to happen, but not what it looks like today.
Very good. All right, well, let's get into Suzette. So we have two vintages here, which is amazing to be able to taste them side by side. So excited about that part. We'll start with the 2016.
This one. Okay. So 2016, this is the first year that our vineyard figures into it. And it is, it's about 45%. Turns out it's 45% from our vineyard. We didn't know that until a year later, right? And you know, we love Grenache from the spot, as Carla said, because of the sand. You can make Grenache in the exact same fashion from 3 kilometers away where it doesn't grow on sand, and it's completely different. So the sand is everything. And we went there really for the sand. That's the first and most important piece. And I'll say that as a lead into an idea which I'm going to immediately debunk or qualify, if you will. And that's to say, when we wanted to make Grenache, we looked around the world. Where do we find sand? Because there's a great example of sand-grown Grenache that looks a lot like Pinot Noir in a wine called Chateau Reyes. You know, it's now also regretfully way too expensive. But I had the opportunity to drink a lot of it, oftentimes blind, from really 1990 in particular. And it looks a lot like Pinot Noir. And when you deconstruct that wine, as you know, that's how we think about winemaking. You approach it as a sommelier. You just unknit the sweater of the things you like and figure out how it came to be. And so when we did that with Reyes, it was like, why is this different than all the other wines around it? And it turns out sand is the element, right? So I'm looking for sand, and then you find the sand, you find the grapes, and you get going. And this is where the appropriation has to stop, at least in total. So, and I say that as an introduction to how we made the wine, and particularly one element, which is whole cluster fermentation. So it's extremely Tony to talk about in like nerdy wine circles these days about whole cluster fermentation and how much you use. And well, Reyes uses 100%, so I use 100%. And I don't mean me, that's what someone else talking. It's something that we look at very much through a different lens, which is to say, just because you know they do it don't mean you can do it in your spot, right? Every spot has its own environmental considerations, maybe different genetic material or genetic material that's evolved over time. And I liken it to, I think I've gotten this analogy down a little bit better, but it's so like making a souffle. You can make a souffle at sea level, right? And it becomes this big, beautiful thing, comes out of the oven, and it's grown, and it's amazing. If you take the exact same recipe to altitude, it doesn't work. It'll fall flat. You have to adjust your recipe because of where you are. And it's the same thing with the winemaking. So if we just go throw 100% whole bunch into our red wine, it's going to come out horrible, and it's going to just be a mouthful of green tannins. And then you've made a wine that's about a singular idea as opposed to something beautiful, right? So with that as the introduction, we want to do all these things in a very measured way. And in this case, we're now, I guess this is what, our third vintage in, and we've tried, you know, we always want to get close to the rail, but not hit it. And so in this vintage, we thought, and we thought by virtue of walking the vineyard, you taste the grapes, you chew the stems, you chew the seeds, and figure out, well, how much of these stems can I include? And we ended up taking a third. And so 35% whole cluster in this particular vintage. It made a total of 800 dozen, so 800 cases. And what else do you want to say here? Okay, so the winemaking itself, when we do whole cluster, all the fermenters are between 2 tons and 5 tons. So that's not very big. You know, a 2-ton fermenter is like, you know, a hot tub for 6 people. It's not huge. So, and maybe a little bit larger. And so the whole cluster stuff goes in the bottom. They're rectangles, so the cap gets spread out. The whole cluster stuff goes in the bottom of these things, and you destem the rest over the top. Yeah, maybe we have some cool pictures.
You just keep talking and I'll show some photos.
And then Carla and I get in there and we walk in it for you know, the first 2 or 3 days until you can get it all broken up. Look, there it is. So these are the fermenters, right? Each one of those is a 2-ton fermenter. And so we walk in it for a couple of days, and so pigeage until things get broken up a little bit, and then you can actually do pump overs, which is what we're doing in the previous photo. And yeah, there you go. That's it. That's literally it. And then a week later, fermentation is nearly finished, and you get to shovel it out. And so here's Carla shoveling it out. But you know, when you do that, there's still plenty of whole bunches in there, and fermentation has occurred within the berry, but
Wow.
you've left a lot of these things whole, which is really a beautiful thing. So you shovel it into what Carla's doing. Here's page, the basket press. So this is a shoveled out tank in the basket press, and it's literally a wood press. And then it takes about 12 hours. The press cycle occurs when we still have roughly 2% potential alcohol remaining. This is to say the wine's still fermenting when we put it in the press, and we do that because we don't want it to oxidize in a dispositive way. It's because it's still fermenting, you're essentially creating a cloak of CO2 around it, and it prevents it from oxidation. And so then it gets pressed into an underground tank where it finishes primary fermentation, and then we put it into the oak. In the case of 2016, it's put entirely in once used or twice used French white wine barrels, right? So we prefer French oak because I think we both agree, actually, American oak is vulgar and disgusting. It's just got too much personality. But French oak being more subtle, both by species and by process, becomes even more subtle when you've had white wine in it, and the white wine itself contributes a floral element. And so we like to age it in those barrels, and it's in there for a year. And then again, bottled, unfined, unfiltered right out of those barrels. Then the next one goes in on top of it.
Before we jump into tasting the 17, I think I want to go back here one moment and just look at the sand. I don't think we touched on, we said we're here because of the sand, but we didn't give you a good idea of like why the sand is so important. So here is a video, give it a minute to load here. Like I said, it's the decomposed granite and quartzite from the Barossa ranges in the Eden Valley, but the sand itself is like the finest beach sand. And that's the wind that's whipping through there constantly. It's super fine sand. It's the kind that sticks on you as soon as you're wet. And so what that sand gives Grenache specifically is exactly what Richard was referencing with Rayas. It gives the Grenache this very lifted aromatic profile. The sand does take a little bit of color from the wine. So you can see in both the 16 and 17 that this is a pretty sheer Grenache. But we couldn't care less because you don't smell color. And what we want is that lifted aromatic profile from the sand. Compared to a lot of other Barossa Grenaches that are grown on that heavy, sticky red clay, that heavy, sticky red clay tends to give a Grenache that looks a little bit more like Shiraz. In fact, it's darker in color, and the fruit quality is also on the darker range. So it's like blackberry, bunch of very, very dark fruits, whereas everything Grenache on the sand is all in the red fruit category squarely. So you've got the strawberries, cherries, pomegranate, cranberry stuff, which to us that helps give warm climate Grenache a bit of a lift and a bit of an elegance that it wouldn't find on its own.
That's really interesting. I wanted to see if you could touch for a second. I still remember the first time that you kind of launched this wine to the trade, and we had a tasting in a restaurant in Chicago, and it was basically like, let's talk about Grenache. It wasn't about approach to relaxation. It was just about Grenache. We did these all blind. It was like 8 to 10 Grenache from all over the world. Wanted to touch on what inspired you to do that versus kind of the normal dog and pony show we see when, hey, we are winemakers now, and we want you to buy and taste our wine.
Thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you for remembering that. That was so thrilling for us. The idea behind it was in the United States. The United States kind of got slapped around a bit by Australian wine, by a lot of bulk Australian wine, by a lot of Australian wine that was inexpensive and not very exciting, and it had a critter on the label. And so what we found that selling in the United States can oftentimes be defending why we're making wine in the Barossa. Why do you care so much? Why is the wine, how we believe that it's going to be great? And we're like, okay, you don't believe that it's going to be great? Game on. So let's taste up against what we think are some of the premier Grenache from all over the planet. So we didn't have Commando G at that time. What is the Spanish?
No, we had some Commando G. We
had Wind Gap. We had Chateau Rayas. We had Isabelle Ferrando, who is also in Chateauneuf. We had Charvan.
In Chateauneuf.
Yep.
What else was in there?
And then
I don't know. It was
we had
basically
John Alban for another tasting. Yeah.
Terroir au Limit.
Terroir au Limit from Spain. They're making great old vine Grenache, and a lot of it's in really intense soil. But we did it blind, and so we didn't tell people we're giving Rayos, which is a very expensive wine at this tasting. That's not what brought them in. We just said, let's taste Grenache and let's talk about the differences here. And we had done a thorough study on how each of these wines were made. We tasted them all, we kind of rated them all blind, and then we revealed the wines and we went through the winemaking for each of them and why certain wines end up with 100% whole cluster, or why certain wines are better with oak or not. So it wasn't about like, hey, we're the best. It was about like, what is good for Grenache? What soil does Grenache like? How much oak does Grenache like? How much whole cluster looks good on Grenache? That's really a great example of how we came to want to make wine like this. We pulled apart all of the pieces and we're like, what is interesting to us and what do we want to put together to make wine that looks like we want it to look?
I think it was a really fascinating tasting because you could really see, stripping away. All right, and there were so many distinct, diverse examples of what can happen. I still remember I said wine number 3 is the most Grenache-iest Grenache, and it ended up being yours. And obviously that was not my intention to be like, oh, you planted me there. But I still remember I think it just is a true, really great representation of what, sandy soil old vine Grenache could be. So on that note, let's move on to 17.
Was a cooler. Yeah, go ahead.
Go for it. Yeah, you're there with me.
17 is a cooler vintage than 16. 17, we love 17. This looks more like Pinot Noir to us than it does like typical Grenache, and that's thrilling to us. It's thrilling that can happen in the Barossa. It's thrilling it shows the power of the sand. And it's cool, like oftentimes, Richard always talks about when he was going through the court and doing, you have to know your vintages and all that. And everyone has like these like A+ vintages. And then a lot of the like C vintages were cold vintages, but we both believe that the cold vintages can oftentimes be really exciting. They're not trying to like outdo everyone else. And so this is a cooler vintage, lots of rain. And for us, this shows the lighter side of Grenache. Here, because it was a cooler vintage and because the stems themselves did not get as ripe as they did in 16, we decided to lower the percentage of whole cluster. So here we have only 20% compared to the 35% that we had in the 16. We've done some tests to look at if we include more whole cluster, what that will do to the wine. We did a test with one small bin of 50% whole cluster, and it took over the wine. It became too tannic. It started to aromatically kind of press down some of the stuff that we're looking for from the Sandgren Grenache. And so we've never gone above 35% since then. And that 50%, we just ended up, it was a very tiny amount. We just blended it in a later vintage. But 20% here, which is the least that we've ever done. And we think it looks good on the wine for this ripeness.
Mm-hmm.
What talk about?
Cold vintage means later harvest because you're waiting and waiting and waiting. So we started this April 29th, which is a full 2 weeks after we finished the previous year's harvest. And it's a whole month after we began the previous year's harvest. So it really gives you an idea of like cold vintages don't necessarily mean rain and like picking early and getting out of the way. It means being brave and waiting till you actually have something that tastes good. So in this case, it was waiting an extra 27 days compared to the previous year, and really finishing in so May 10th. That's like harvesting in the northern hemisphere in November. That's late. But it's a delicate wine. And what I also really like to do with this wine is if this is the perfect example of why color doesn't matter. If you are drinking it and you have it in your glass, you turn it over and look down through it, it's so pale. It's so beautiful, but then you smell it and it has so much to say, right? And it's just proof that, color doesn't equal flavor at all, not in any way, shape, or form. So, I mean, to me, this is the most beautiful thing I think I've ever been a part of making as far as wine. I love it.
Mm-hmm. When you have a vintage like 17 where it's later picking, what are some of the concerns that kind of the vine field gives you in the vineyard that you have to be concerned about and watch for?
I mean, actually, the vine field gives you a little bit of an insurance policy relative to the rest of the valley. and that insurance policy is the wind. So it dries things out. Like if it rains, everybody's in the weeds, so to speak. But if you're not in a windy place, rot can take over. And rot can take over where we are too. You have to be super careful. Like 2011 was a complete washout for so many people, like the entirety of the Barossa. But you know, in a vintage like 2017, a lot of people would just pick, wash up, and go fishing. And we had the luxury of waiting for something good, really with kind of this added, you know, again, they call it the vine veil nurse because she keeps the grapes well. The wind really helps the health, essentially, and keeping down rot. So it's interesting. Of course, it's dangerous, and there are no guarantees, but it's a little bit safer along the way.
Certainly. I see we have a question here. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about what you are smelling and what you're tasting out of the 17 vintage, because it is such a unique vintage for you?
Yeah, I think the 17, I think in terms of comparisons. So for me, in the 16, you have, it's still on the red spectrum of fruit, but you have kind of riper strawberry, riper cherry. You have summer fruits that have gotten like big and plump and they've been sun-kissed. And on the 17, you have more of the winter red fruits, so more like cranberry and pomegranate. So maybe a little bit more tart red fruit, as opposed to this kind of sun-kissed, big, lush thing. You still have the palate feel of ripe fruit. It is properly ripe, but it just didn't get that same kind of pump of sun that the 16 did.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So where are you in the, when did you release 17 to the US market? Kind of where are you in that, in the vintage?
Right now, this is the first tasting we've done with the 17. It just arrived. Yeah, it just arrived.
Wonderful. And what do we have to look forward to in the next couple of vintages? What was 18 and 19 like, so we can prepare our cellars for the arrivals of those in the next couple of years?
Very, very little wine. But we'll tell you why. It's not because it's being sold somewhere else. It's because some of it's climate change, a lot of it's drought the past few years, and wind at flowering. So right when the flowers are starting to push the flowers that will become clusters, that heavy wind, the vine veil nurse, the past few years has come through right at flowering and knocked off a bunch of the flowers. So the vine itself will push again, but it pushes less than it did its original time. And so you have less clusters coming on each vine. What you did see here, this is a great example. You see the cluster in Richard's hand. This must be 17 where we took this photo.
It's cold.
Because it's cold, and because the clusters were super, super small. That's beside the point. Sometimes when there's wind at flowering and the vine pushes again, the clusters that you get are going to be a lot smaller. And you're going to have a slightly more tannic wine because the ratio of juice to skins is different. And there's just going to be less wine overall. So for 18, 19, and 20, we have the worst out of the 3 years. We're down 70% of our normal.
Oh, wow.
80?
Down 80%.
God. But we're not changing the cost of the wine. We made a decision. We know winemakers who, and it makes perfect business sense to change the cost based on what the vintage gives you. But we made a decision not to do that. So the cost of the wine will stay the same. There will just be a lot less wine. To give you an example, we have the numbers in front of us. In 2016 and 2017, we had 820 dozen and 847 dozen. And then 2018 was great. We made a ton of wine. And then 2019 and 2020 was far less.
A ton of wine is what? 1,300 cases.
It's a lot for us.
It's not, yeah, it's not very much. In the scheme of things, it's tiny. And we are selling it around the world now, which is nice. We're big in Japan. Who knew? True.
So
there you go.
There's a bunch of wine. It was a great year for everyone in the Barossa. And then 19 and 20, we're dealing probably, if 850-ish was normal, we're down to 700 cases. Yeah, and 20, I don't know, we haven't bottled 20, so we don't know what 20 looks like.
I can tell you, I just do the math. So 20 is going to be a total of Grenache of about 275 cases.
Yeah.
So that's
so we should stock up on 17 and 16 and while we can. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, if you like it.
When will
Yeah.
you be going back down to the Barossa for 21? What's kind of what's coming up for you in your travels?
You ready for the sad song? No, we can't go there. There's still north of 30,000 Australians stranded abroad. They repatriate them. So we're a year in, right? And they have been repatriating them at a rate of like 200 a week, right? So I don't, and you have to like, what's the wisdom of that? Like, how is that happening? And I was just talking about this the other day with a friend, and it's like, they must, so, you know, COVID's very much under control there. They're having a summer, and the economy is not entirely opened up, but properly functioning. And I really feel like these poor people are stranded abroad because they don't want to bring it back and have to close it all down again.
Sure.
So if you're Australian, you can get on a list to go home. And if you're an American couple that owns a vineyard down there, you can pound sand. Honestly, we couldn't go to last year's harvest, and we can't go to this year's either. I mean, thankfully last year was tiny, right? It filled one of those fermenters. And thankfully, we've been working with the Canute family down there for 20 years, and they know what we like and how we do it, and so on and so forth. So that was really fortunate. You know, I said that, and I think like the gods tempted us and said, "Oh yeah, well here's another small vintage. So this vintage is going to look just like last vintage in terms of quantity, which sucks. But you know, the silver lining is it's not a gigantic headache for our friends down there who are basically making this for us this year."
And one more thing I'll say about the small yields. Last year, talking to winemakers in the Barossa whose vines didn't know how to deal with the drought, or their farming wasn't super responsible, or they decided they had this old vine vineyard and they decided to take it off the drippers, like its watering system, and they decided to do it that vintage without knowing that it was going to be a drought vintage. There's one like well-known vineyard down there that they decided to change the farming and take the old vines off drippers, off their water supply, and they died. They scorched this old vine vineyard in this drought year. And so having old vines that are dry grown, it is so helpful to have, they've been brought up dry grown. They've not been on water for as long as anybody can remember. And so even in drought years, they will go deep, deep, deep down into that clay, and they will hit some sort of water source in that clay, which is a very, very moist, absorbent soil. So we're lucky that we're in an area where that can happen, and where we're dry farming. And so the vines have found like a stasis with this specific location, and they can survive even the third, like it was 2 big drought years, and our vines did fine. They pushed less fruit because of the wind at flowering, but the clusters themselves were healthy, and the fruit itself is absolutely beautiful. And the wines that we've made are great. There's just far, far less of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, wonderful. Well, Carla, Richard, this was awesome. It was great to see you both again, and to taste these wines and to share them here. So if, like me, you have drank all 3 of these wines, or at least opened them up, you can go back to Benchmark Wine Group to grab some more of these. I know that they've stocked up on these 3. And what's the best place for those of us on the call here on Facebook Live? How do people get in touch with you to find out more about An Approach to Relaxation and what you're up to?
Anapproachtorelaxation.com is a great way. Yeah, that's pretty much where we have all the updated information. And we're both pretty active on Instagram if you're into that. He's at YoBets and I'm at Carla Rizabets. Riza is RZA. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. Thank you to the team at Benchmark for letting us put this together, and safe travels back to Amsterdam, and hopefully the floodgates of Australia open up sooner than later, so you can get back to your vineyard. So I know you'll want to get back as soon as possible. But thank you both again. This is awesome, and the wines are tasting great. So congratulations and good luck. Keep doing what you're doing. Love you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thank you, everybody.